You've been force-fed the lie that slavery was some uniquely American evil, and you can blame Hollywood blockbusters, sanitized high school textbooks, and selective documentaries for this global amnesia. Everyone pictures slavery as cotton fields in the American South, or at worst, sugar plantations in the Caribbean, neatly boxed, cinematic, comfortably distant. But here's the brutal truth: Hollywood glorifies the antebellum South's drama, and textbooks dodge anything messier or beyond Mount Rushmore. Wake up: ancient Greece, Rome, China, and the Middle East ran on slavery for centuries. Romans didn't just use slaves, they had actual instruction manuals like Columella's de Re Rustica from the 1st century on managing enslaved people. Still want receipts? Medieval North Africa's slave markets appear clearly in the Cairo Geniza documents from the 11th century, where ransoming Christian captives was business as usual. If you believed this was ancient history, think again. The Global Slavery Index today reports millions enslaved worldwide. Thought America had the monopoly. Congrats, you've been binge-watching Hollywood reboots instead of facing reality. It's like expecting only zombies in movies and ignoring the fact that real pandemics are still happening. While slavery is often associated primarily with the Atlantic world, it is important to recognize that its foundations were more complex than simply being based on race. You've been fed a lazy, Hollywood-fueled lie. Slavery has always been about race. Black and white. Good versus evil. If you believed shackles came in only one color, thank centuries of pop history and dry textbooks for that blatant fiction. Today, most picture slavery as brutally race-based, blame American plantations, roots, and every school history chart ever. But here's the shocker: Victorian Britain and early 20th century America pounded this myth to cleanse their own guilt and look morally superior. In ancient Rome, skin color was irrelevant. Check Cicero's 1st century BCE letters, where Greeks, Gauls, and Romans all scrubbed floors side by side. Archaeology from Pompeii and 21st century BCE Mesopotamia proves slaves were prisoners of war, debtors, or political victims. Race, not even close to the priority list. If you still think slavery was always black and white, congratulations, you're basically a smug Victorian historian in robes. Like believing Netflix documentaries are the ultimate truth. Absurd, right? Understanding that slavery was not always race-based challenges the common perception that Africans were solely victims in this system. Hollywood lied. Africans were not just helpless victims chained and silent in the story of slavery. If you believe this sanitized myth fed to you by school textbooks and silver screen villains, wake up. The real history is raw, brutal, and far messier than any blockbuster would dare show. Forget the fairy tale of European ships swooping in to snatch passive villagers without resistance. That lie was spun by guilt-ridden Victorian historians desperate for a black and white narrative. In truth, African kingdoms were ruthless players in the trade. William Bosman, a ruthless 18th century Dutch trader, exposed how Gold Coast rulers bartered captives like stock at bustling docks. 17th century port records from Ouida reveal African merchants driving cutthroat bargains, setting prices with cold calculation. Nigerian historian Jeff Ade Ajayi, through 20th century oral histories, uncovered how African groups launched savage raids on rivals, flooding the human market. But don't assume it was all collaboration. Queen Nzinga of 17th century Angola fiercely resisted the Portuguese invasion, leading brutal battles and defying colonizers at every turn. If you swallowed the innocent bystander's fairy tale, congratulations, you've been hoodwinked by Hollywood's comfort junk food. Next time someone parrots the triangle trade story, throw in the spider's web metaphor and watch their brain freeze like a dial-up modem stuck in a buffering loop. Recognizing African participation in slavery provides a broader context when considering Europe's role as abolitionists. You've been spoon-fed a polished fairy tale. If you think Europe was slavery's white knight, thank Hollywood and self-congratulatory Victorian textbooks for that lie. The popular myth casts Europeans as heroic liberators, galloping in to smash bondage's chains single-handedly. This overblown legend was forged by British imperial propagandists, national curriculums desperate for a hero narrative, and films like Amazing Grace that whitewash centuries of filthy lucre. Here's the ugly truth. European empires and wealthy families were built on slave labor. Open the British parliamentary debates from 1790, and you'll find politicians salivating over transatlantic profits abolition nowhere near their minds. Meanwhile, real pioneers like Olaudah Equiano were exposing these atrocities in memoirs from 1789, only to be steamrolled by sanitized rewrites. If you think Parliament abruptly embraced virtue, congratulations, you bought the Disney version. Believing Europe invented abolition is like crediting ExxonMobil with inventing solar panels. While Europeans are often celebrated as primary abolitionists, it is also revealing to explore how slavery existed and was experienced in ancient times. You've been duped about ancient slaves, and you can blame Hollywood and those overdramatic Victorian historians with their wild beards and even wilder distortions. The idea that every Greek and Roman slave suffered endless misery is not just lazy, it's a scandalous falsehood nobody bothered to fact-check. If you believed slaves were doomed to a life worse than your worst Monday, think again. Hollywood's toga, draped sobbing extras, and 19th century penny dreadfuls loved to rake in the tragedy. But 4th century BCE Greek texts like Xenophon's Sharp Economicus reveal slaves as trusted estate managers handling their master's finances. Jump forward to 6th century CE Roman law in the Digest of Justinian's slaves worked as esteemed doctors, educators, and even entrepreneurs who could buy their freedom. Pompeii excavations. Slave quarters discovered there are often comfier than some modern Airbnbs. So if you pictured all slaves shackled and miserable, congrats, you just bought Hollywood's recycled fake history. Some Roman slaves had wealth to rival today's top influencers. Maybe don't let every sword and sandal blockbuster rewrite the past for you. Exploring the ancient conditions of slavery leads us to question the common belief that medieval Europe was free from slavery. You've been conned again by Hollywood and textbook authors pushing the fairy tale that medieval Europe was a utopia of noble knights and free peasants. Here's the brutal truth: unfree labor was everywhere, and the idea that the Middle Ages were slavery-free is pure, deliberate historical fiction. If you believed that after Rome's fall, Europe magically wiped slavery off the map and birthed chivalry and freedom overnight, you've swallowed a Victorian-era myth cooked up by historians desperate to paint Europe as morally superior. Every epic movie with peasants as nothing but muddy extras hiding chains. That's propaganda. Actual medieval law codes from the 7th through 12th centuries constantly mention slaves called servi. The 7th century Visigothic code even spells out punishments for harming slaves. 9th century Carolingian manumission contracts are not just dusty parchments, they're cold, hard receipts for human lives, proving serfs were far from simple farmhands. Need proof in the dirt. Early medieval English graves studied in the 2000s reveal isolated burials, unmistakably for unfree individuals. If you thought medieval peasants had more freedom than your 9-to-5 grind, congratulations, you just flunked the real history test. It's like believing Hogwarts teaches Muggle history. Acknowledging the persistence of slavery in medieval times helps us understand that legal abolition did not instantly erase it. You've been flat out lied to by your high school history textbook, and every Oscar bait period drama slavery 999 did not vanish the moment it was outlawed. Hollywood sells you a tidy, feel-good ending, but the truth is brutal and blood-soaked. If you believed the second abolition laws wiped out slavery like a magic wand, you've been duped by centuries of whitewashed history and films like Lincoln that sanitize genocide. Politicians love pushing this fairy tale to collect easy moral brownie points. Here's the cold, hard truth. Even after the British Empire outlawed slavery in the 19th century, British ships kept smuggling enslaved humans documented in United Nations archives, dating back over 100 years. Fast forward to today, the 21st century, and UN global reports on trafficking in persons are filled with chilling survivor testimonies. In the United States, freedom often meant forced labor through convict leasing, a grotesque system revealed in Douglas Blackman's landmark 20th century book, Slavery by Another Name. Think slavery ended. That's like believing incognito mode hides your browsing. Not even your mom buys that. Who profits when you swallow this lie? Everyone comfortable ignoring the millions still trapped in modern slavery, hidden casually in plain sight. Even after abolition laws, certain forms of slavery, like those on plantations, continued to dominate perceptions of the institution. Hollywood sold you a lie plantation. Slavery wasn't the whole story of forced labor in the Americas. Blame Gone with the Wind, dime store histories, and lazy high school textbooks obsessed with grand southern mansions. You picture massive cotton or sugar plantations and think, that's slavery in a nutshell. Classic movies, American textbooks, and tourist traps pushed this plantation myth for shock value and neat stories. Here's the brutal truth: city slave labor was everywhere. 18th century Havana and New Orleans city records list enslaved carpenters, dock workers, street vendors, blacksmiths, nothing like the plantation porch stereotype. Parish employment rolls from 19th century Brazil and Charleston slave passes from the early 1800s reveal urban enslaved people living semi-independently. And get this, 17th century Barbados census records prove most enslavers owned just a handful of people, not huge human herds. If you thought all enslaved people were stuck shoveling sugarcane, you might also believe New York City is nothing but Central Park and hot dog carts. If you bought this myth, it's time to rethink everything. Focusing on plantation slavery naturally draws attention to the United States and its association with cotton production. Hollywood lied. American slavery was not just endless cotton fields under a blazing sun. If you believed that plantation fantasy sold by blockbusters and Southern nostalgia, you've been blinded to the raw, grimy truth. Slavery in America was not just rural, it was fiercely urban, industrial, and hiding in plain sight. Every textbook parrots the cotton picker myth, fueled by Gone with the Wind and plantation epics. But real historical records from the 19th century, like the 1860 U.S. Census, expose thousands of enslaved city workers, blacksmiths, carpenters, factory hands. Philadelphia's early 19th century archives prove enslaved labor built city halls and commercial centers. Newspapers from New York and Baltimore overflowed with ads chasing runaway enslaved bakers, shipbuilders, and tailors' professions Hollywood erases. If you believed slavery ended where the cotton stopped, you bought the same historic fiction as thinking fast food only exists at McDonald's. Next time you walk down a quaint city street, remember those bricks were laid by enslaved hands, so much for just hoeing fields. Though slavery in the U.S. is often linked with cotton plantations, it's crucial to recognize the broader narrative about the supposed end of slavery in the developed world. You've been fed a feel-good lie: slavery didn't vanish ages ago. Hollywood, your high school history books, and smug politicians all want you to believe it's ancient history. But while you were applauding, slavery just got a sinister rebrand. If you thought slavery ended somewhere between Amazing Grace and Lincoln's top hat, think again. Thanks to movies like Amistad and those dusty museum dioramas, you probably picture slavery as old, sepia-toned misery sealed away by heroic abolitionists. Here's the harsh truth according to the International Labor Organization in 2017. More than 24 million people are trapped in modern slavery right now: sex trafficking, forced labor, sweatshops hidden in your very own neighborhood. The Victorians loved virtue signaling, but brutally ignored child labor and Dickensian workhouses in mid-19th century London. So if you believed slavery was canceled like a bad reality show, congratulations, Hollywood lied straight to your face. Modern slavery is still thriving, and it's more grotesquely normal than owning a smartphone. The belief that slavery has ended may contribute to the misconception that enslaved people were passive rather than active agents. You've been sold a sanitized lie. Hollywood and dusty Victorian-era textbooks want you to see enslaved people as eternally passive, quietly accepting their chains. The brutal truth: it's been buried deeper than a pirate's treasure chest, erased by 19th century historians and classic films, whitewashing centuries of fierce resistance. If you believed enslaved folks never fought back, you've fallen for the biggest myth of all, imagining their lives as endless misery, without a single spark of defiance. Wake up in 18th century Jamaica. The letter of the enslaved Africans to the king wasn't a plea, it was a threat of full-scale revolt, shredding the myth of silence. Across early 20th century American court records, sabotage runs rampant, tools mysteriously breaking. Fields deliberately ruined, quiet guerrilla warfare inked into our legal history. If you dare to look. and the Haitian Revolution. French colonial reports expose how enslaved people toppled a global empire, rewriting history with blood and fire. If you think real rebellion only belongs to Star Wars rebels or Marvel superheroes, congratulations, you've swapped hard reality for your Hollywood fantasy. Understanding enslaved people's resistance expands our view of freedom beyond mere legal manumission. Hollywood lied freedom in the ancient world wasn't just about flashing a magic manumission stamp. If you believed every dusty textbook or period drama, you bought the Victorian lie legal-obsessed historians from the 19th century who boxed history into neat, boring categories. Their rule: no official paperwork, no freedom. Sounds airtight, right? Nope. Archaeologists from the University of Michigan busted this myth in the early 21st century by digging up Roman-Egyptian graves where freed people mixed with citizens, flaunting grave goods and hybrid titles that screamed, "Rules." We don't know her. Letters from the powerful Familia Caesaris in the 1st century reveal ex-slaves running businesses. No formal act required, just social freedom on the ground. Believing a certificate made you free is like waiting for your divorce to hit trending on TikTok, pointless and absurd. If you bought that, congrats, you've just been expertly lawyered by Victorian ghosts wearing top hats. Limiting freedom to legal release obscures the ongoing issues like the persistence of child slavery today. You've been punked Hollywood and feel-good documentaries push child slavery as some shocking modern horror. But the truth: those so-called enlightened Victorians and blockbuster writers deliberately scrubbed centuries of brutal history from view. If you believe child slavery is a new evil revealed only in undercover exposés or guilt-trip newsreels about sweatshops, think again. Victorian moralists spun a fantasy where history before them was all innocent storybooks and knitting circles, while movies lazily blame Dickensian sweatshops and stop there. But ancient Sumerian cuneiform tablets from the 3rd millennium BCE actually record kids sold as debt payments, real stone receipts for human trafficking. 15th century Renaissance Venice. Merchant ledgers list children as luxury servants, complete with papal permission slips. Even 17th century England kept records like the notorious Northampton Register, binding poor children into long forced apprenticeships. If you swallowed the lie that child slavery only exploded with viral exposés or sneaker ad campaigns, congratulations, you bought the historical Photoshop. Families selling kids wasn't a glitch in the system. It was the system itself, like a cruel software no update can fix. Approaching modern slavery highlights the need to recognize that experiences vary, including differences between men and women. Hollywood lied. Slavery was not a gender-neutral nightmare where men and women suffered identically. If you believe this, you're missing the brutal, gendered realities buried deep in ancient law codes and lost diaries. Everyone sees slavery as one massive, miserable blur, chained, ragged, equally doomed. Blame movies like Spartacus and Victorian-era abolitionist pamphlets for hammering slavery into a one-size-fits-all tragedy. But the truth: gender drew the battle lines of suffering. The 18th century BCE Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, for example, made slave women legal concubines, while men were forced into fields or war. Fast forward to an 1830s South Carolina plantation diary, a wife records pregnant slave women birthing again and again, while male slaves are constantly watched for attempts to escape. Roman tombs reveal female skeletons scarred by sexual violence, while men's bones show the brutal toll of backbreaking labor. Still want to claim slavery was the same for everyone? Congratulations, you just did history on the easiest difficulty setting. Denying gender's brutal role in slavery is like pretending reality TV isn't rigged. You're smarter than that, right? Acknowledging gendered experiences invites a deeper look into the cultural impacts that slaves had on societies. You've been flat out lied to by textbooks and costume dramas. The idea that enslaved people were invisible, silent shadows with no cultural impact, is a Victorian-era fabrication, polished and promoted by Hollywood, the same industry obsessed with ball gowns and sprawling plantations, but terrified to credit those who actually built the culture. The story peddled to millions. Enslaved people vanished into the background, leaving behind only tragic statistics. Dead wrong. Every note of jazz, blues, and gospel screams African invention musicologist Samuel Charters in the 1950s, traced that blues rhythm straight back through slavery's barbed wire fences. Southern food. Dishes like gumbo and hoppin' john appear in Abby Fisher's 1881 cookbook, brimming with deep African culinary roots. Even Brer Rabbit Disney sanitized it times over, but Joel Chandler Harris' Uncle Remus tales from 1880 directly descend from West African folktales, still swallowing the lie that Southern flavor just happened. Congratulations, Aunt Jemima might as well have written your history test. Next time you're at brunch, ask if Grandma's biscuits hold a copyright signed by Victorian fiction. If you believe the Hollywood version, it's time to rethink everything. Recognizing slaves' cultural contributions challenges the notion that the West is innocent of modern forms of slavery. You've been fed a lie. Spun by smug politicians and saccharine documentaries, modern slavery is someone else's nightmare. But strip off the Made in the West sticker, and you'll uncover hidden chains lurking just beneath the surface. For decades, Hollywood and the media have pushed the fairy tale that slavery only thrives over there, far from Europe or North America, while corporations conveniently erase our guilt. If you bought that, you swallowed the biggest myth whipped up since the 19th century. Abolitionists supposedly ended slavery, an illusion boosted by sugary government reports and chirpy 90s news specials. Reality check: a U.S. Department of Labor probe from 2022 exposed over 130 products tied to forced or child labor, from chocolate bars, seafood on your plate, to the glossy smartphone you clutch every day. Europe's glamorous fashion world. The Clean Clothes campaign has been exposing wage slavery and sweatshops from Leicester to Naples since the late 1980s. Think local produce or high-end labels make you immune. Even supermarket eggs in the United Kingdom have been linked to trafficked labor. If you still believe slave labor means dusty history books, congratulations, you fell for the marketing stunt of the century, like thinking reality TV is actually real.